So we've come to the part of the afternoon that I'm sure some of you have been waiting for, and I know that the young lady in the front row has been desperately waiting for, because she's always so excited to speak in front of people. I don't know why she even gets nervous, because she's so wonderful at it. But Stacey Jane, for whom we are all grateful that we are here, is, to name just a few accolades, was the Rotary Inspirational Woman of the Year award winner in 2023, the Rotary City and Urban Award winner in 2023, the Illawarra Institute of Business Innovative Businesswoman of the Year award in 2022, was a winner of the New South Wales Women of the Year awards in 2022, and a Westfield Local Hero award in 2021. So just a remarkable story, from despair to hope, from sadness to joy, and as I said earlier, from Brummie to Aussie. But please put your hands together and welcome Stacey Jane.
Thanks, Margie. I'll pay you later. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to High Tea at Tiffany's. My name is Stacy Jane, and I'm the founder and CEO of Escabags. I stand before you today not only as a victim of domestic abuse, but as a survivor. I have fought through darkness to reclaim my life, and one now filled with love, compassion, pride, and most importantly, freedom from fear. Today I stand strong and empowered to amplify the voices of those still trapped in the silent prisons of their homes and the terror of intimate partner violence. For too long we've been afraid to call domestic abuse what it truly is: terrorism. But that is what it is. It's a calculated, sustained attack on the heart, mind, body, and soul of another person. And it's up to us, all of us, to give a voice to those who have been silenced by it. For those of you unfamiliar with Escabags, we're an Australian registered charity founded in February 2010, not 2010. Oh God, now we've started. Dedicated to providing free escape bags for those escaping domestic and family abuse across Australia. Our escape bags are distributed through our network of Escabags stockists, which include police stations, hospitals, schools, banks, and other privately owned businesses, places that choose to stand up for kindness and human dignity. Our motto is simple yet profound. You don't have to be a certain type of business to become a stockist, just a kind one. Our escape bags come in two variations: single adult and parent and child. While they're not gender specific, we know that it's mainly women and children that do use our service. Our escape bags are filled with the essential items needed for that critical moment of escape, a moment that is often the most dangerous time for victims. It's when the perpetrator, sensing that loss of control, becomes the most lethal. And it's then that an escape bag can literally be the difference between life or death. So, it will probably come as no surprise to you all that Escabags was founded from my own experience with domestic abuse. So I'm going to share some of those experiences with you all now to give you a better understanding of myself, the journey of Escabags to date, and the heart, pain, and resilience that fuel it. As you can hear, I'm not Australian. And I'm from a big, beautiful city called Birmingham. Woo. Someone just yay Birmingham. Woo. Yay, thank you. Oh, you've missed my next gag. And that's probably the only time you'll hear beautiful and Birmingham in the same sentence, but it's home all the same. However, Birmingham is the home of the Peaky Blinders. Sorry, Tommy Shelby couldn't attend this evening. Tried. UB40, Ozzy Osbourne, and of course, the best, oh Sally, I love you, the greatest football team in the English Premier League, Aston Villa. All right, don't jump on the bandwagon. Probably a blue nose. Anyway, back to the serious stuff. But back home in beautiful Birmingham, I found myself trapped in an abusive relationship. The abuse was regularly physical, but worst of all for me was the psychological and emotional abuse that he covertly packaged as love. From the very beginning of our relationship, he collected a log of my biggest insecurities and fears, only to use them against me or manipulate me in the most twisted of ways. In fact, the only time I ever stopped fearing him was when I didn't value my own life or existence anymore, because this was bigger than me and bigger than I could handle emotionally. What made things even worse was that my every move, conversation and bank transaction was monitored through the use of software on my mobile phone, listening devices in my home disguised as household objects, and even a tracking device on my car. When I made the mistake of opening up to my grandmother one day and told her about this new relationship, I got in the car and he sent a full audio file of the whole conversation. So not only was he listening, he wanted me to know that he was. Eventually I just stopped talking and stopped moving, not realising the unhealthy psychological bond that was forming, which I now know to be a trauma bond. All I did know was that the worse he treated me, the more I needed him to make me feel better. He was both my poison and my remedy. The abuse was relentless, but it was the psychological chains that bound me most tightly. It wasn't just fear that kept me there, it was a trauma bond. And for those unfamiliar, a trauma bond is a cruel, cruel paradox. It traps you in a cycle of affection and abuse, where moments of kindness from your abuser become the very reason you stay. You are starved of love, only to be fed the smallest scraps. And in that starvation, you begin to believe that this is all you deserve. Which is why you can't just leave. Which is why healing from a trauma bond often requires recognising those unhealthy dynamics at play and seeking support from trusted individuals around you and often professionals. As with many people who don't immediately understand a trauma bond or the cycle of abuse, I lost a lot of friendships back home. I remember my best friend saying to me she'd wake up in fear of the police knocking on her door one morning to say that her best friend had been murdered, and how she would tell my 2-year-old godson. People couldn't understand why I didn't just leave. But I was trapped. I was too scared to stay, but the thought of leaving was even more terrifying, especially as going to the police was not an option for me. I would actually pack my own escape bag. He would lock me in the house most days, but on the odd occasion he'd forget. And I remember being stood at that front door for what seemed like a lifetime. It was as if an electric fence was there stopping me from escaping. The fear of what would happen if he happened to come home at the same time that I would run. It would make me feel physically sick with fear, so I would frantically unpack that bag, making sure that I put every item in exactly the same place so that I didn't warn him. That's why I couldn't just leave. Another friend of mine gave me a very small, very light, disposable phone. They had one too. No numbers were saved, but I knew what number to call in an emergency. I hid that phone under a desk, which I knew that only my small wrist could fit underneath, with a big blob of blue tack. How I won Innovative Woman of the Year, I don't know. But I would honestly sit in fear every night and lie in bed every night thinking, what if that bloody blob of blue tack unsticks to alert him of my only lifeline? That's why I couldn't just leave. That was until March 2019 when everything changed. We travelled to Australia to go on a cruise around New Zealand together. It was a make or break holiday in his mind, but any time he made us leave Birmingham, it was never a holiday or a break for me. It was just another way that he would continue his acts of abuse away from my usual support network, who I was never allowed to tell where we were going or when we were going. However, on that cruise, we'd met a wonderful Australian family. And after seeing me alone on several occasions, they took me under their wing. Little did I know that the same group of people would go on to save my life. On the last night of the cruise, I'd said goodbyes to my new friends, only to be very violently attacked on my return to the cabin. But this time, it would be the last time. Security were alerted with the people that were in the cabin next door, and I got put in a different cabin on the other side of the ship. He, like most cowards, hid and was nowhere to be found. But there's only so far you can go on a ship that's yet to dock. And unfortunately, according to Mozzie, that wasn't overboard. That would make great shark bait, as seen on A Current Affair recently. Gangster. But the level of control that he always maintained meant that I was never allowed access to the safe or the code to the safe. So I was unable to retrieve my phone, my bank cards, but more importantly, my passport. And I sat in that cabin alone that night, absolutely terrified, thinking, it's bad enough that this is going on back home. Now I'm absolutely stranded on the other side of the world in just the dress that I was wearing that night. But the following morning, unbeknown to me, security saw my new Australian friends at breakfast, and they explained the situation to them. At this point, they could have got off the ship and continued with their lives, but they didn't. We'd already said our goodbyes, and I wouldn't have known any different. And shortly after 7 a.m. that morning, along with security, there they all were, 7 very concerned looking faces with a plate of breakfast and a cup of tea. They came into my cabin, looked at each other and looked back at me and said, "This is the start of your new life and you're coming home with us." And I did. Looking back, it was probably the single most bravest decision that I'd ever made in my life. Security told us that they'd keep him on the ship until they'd had the go-ahead from staff that I'd safely left the port. I slept most of the way back, and I remember waking up to be told, "I'm so sorry, Mozzie, I've got to do your accent." I usually do this when Mozzie's not here. "Don't worry, love, you'll be safe here with me." I can't believe it was your bloody accent that got me the clap. Not that kind of clap, that sounds awful. I'm getting to that bit, Mozzie. We're ruining the punchline. Anyway, so we got to the point. "Don't worry, love, you'll be safe enough." So I got off the minibus, a little disorientated, only to walk up the garden path and have my very first encounter with a brown snake. And honestly, that thing shot out in front of me like it was on bloody skates. And I thought I'd left the snake on the ship, to be fair. But I obviously had to return back to England a week later, which is when I moved into a women's shelter. And unfortunately, that wasn't the sanctuary that I'd hoped it'd be either. Drug use, prostitution and neglect surrounded me. It was a new kind of struggle, one that stripped away my dignity, but I held on. I became too frightened to use the communal kitchens, so I lived off anything that could be made from the hot water in the kettle that I'd brought from my little room. As a result, my weight plummeted and I started to lose my hair. So in a way, the abuse had continued because I was now starting to neglect myself. There's been a show recently on Netflix called Made. Has anyone seen it? Yeah. Good, that saves me a job. But for those of you that haven't, it's about a single mother who turns to cleaning houses to make ends meet as she escapes domestic abuse and overcomes homelessness. That for me was the closest representation to my time in that women's shelter, and I loved how the producers didn't focus on the abuse itself. It was all about the struggle to escape, survive and rebuild, both mentally and physically, which can sometimes be overlooked. And it really took me back to that time in the women's shelter. My room was on its own on the 3rd floor. I used to call it the penthouse suite, despite the maggots, but that's another story. But it was also 5 flights of stairs up. And I remember moving in that day, lugging all my belongings up those 5 flights of stairs and thinking, where are all these other women that have walked through these doors before me? Why aren't they here to say hello or give me a hand? And the longer I stayed there, I realised that that isn't an environment that you can grow in. And unfortunately, those other 6 women had stopped growing. And I believe that's because they felt like society or the system had truly turned their back on them, causing them to adapt to a situation that they simply didn't belong in. I remember my first night there going for a shower and realising that I didn't have a towel, and it sounds like such a trivial thing that we all take for granted. But I just stood there, very cold, very naked, vulnerable, worthless. I cried so much on that dirty tiled floor until I eventually dried off. But during these long and isolated 4 months, there was always one daily phone call, which I truly believed helped me from descending into complete darkness. And that was from my Aussie mum, or Mozzie, as we all like to call her. Can we just give her a clap? The same lady that rescued me from the cruise. When I told her that my abuser had located me again, she simply said, I'm sorry, I've got to do it again. Come home, bub. And I did. I made the decision to push all my chips to the centre of the table and stop paddling away like a relentless duck. That the most appropriate and safe thing for me to do was to let go, stop paddling and let the river of life take me to where and who I needed to be with at that time. So on the 16th of August 2019, I boarded a flight with a one-way ticket to Australia and moved in with Mozzie and her family in the Southern Highlands, which is where I applied for a protection visa, which was only 5 months after we'd originally met each other on that cruise. 3 months into living with Mozzie, something cracked and I became very, very unwell. I was suffering from terrible nightmares, flashbacks, and sometimes panic attacks up to 3 or 4 times a day. Always chokes me. Mozzie would hear my cries in the middle of the night, and I would find her on her knees at the end of my bed, giving me a foot massage, soothing me back to sleep like any wonderful mother would do. But Mozzie took me to the doctors one day, and they sat us both in a room on our own and wrapped me in a blanket as I trembled and sobbed. They then sent us straight to the hospital, which is when I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I think I'd spent so long in survival mode that when my brain and body started to relax over here, the magnitude of what had happened to me over those several years really started to dawn on me. Now, In the women's shelter, we were always being encouraged to take part in different activities, but no one really did due to poor mental health and low self-esteem. But there was one class, and it was a make and mend class, to learn the basics of a sewing machine and how to make a simple tote bag. Here's one I made earlier. It's not for sale, but when I'm dead and gone, we can auction it for top dollar. It took me 5 hours, but I remember feeling so at peace in my own little bubble, completely detached from the reality of my situation. So when Mozzie asked me that day, what can we help you with to help alleviate some of these symptoms of domestic abuse? I said, Mozzie, I'm going to get a sewing machine. And I remember the look on your face. You rolled your eyes and I could see what you were thinking. Self-defence classes, mental health support, you want a bloody sewing machine. Anyway, so I started making tote bags just to help with my mental health. But it had been quite a few months since I'd made my very first tote bag in the women's shelter. And poor Mozzie would be running up and down that garden path to re-sew that machine and re-thread it I don't know how many times. But one day I finally completed my first one here in Australia. And one of the most beautiful memories I have of Mozzie and I is of me running down that garden path shouting, Mozzie, Mozzie, I did it, I did it. And for some strange reason, which I'm sure only universe understands, we held each other and cried. For poor Mozzie, it was probably out of relief. But I got to the point I'd made so many of these bloody bags I couldn't give them away. How many have you got still, on average? 50? You've got rid of them? Security, get her out. Honest to God, thought you loved me. Anyway, so I started to consider what can I use these bags for to help people that are currently in a situation to what I was once in. And this took me back to a particularly violent incident, and one that I unfortunately will be able to forget, both physically and psychologically, for the rest of my life. As I tried to escape out the front door, I remember suddenly being on the floor. I can honestly say I do not remember him striking me at any point or how I was on the floor. All I remember is him turning me over and strangling me. I obviously tried to put up a fight, which is when he moved his body onto my chest. And with his knees buried into my shoulders, I couldn't do anything. I was completely immobilised by him. And the last thing I remember, before I blacked out, was looking at the bottom of the radiator in his hallway and thinking that that would honestly be the last thing that I ever saw in my life. But then I looked back at him and his eyes turned very, very dark, almost black. Finally, I managed to crawl out the front door, and I remember him locking the glass door, picking up his phone and hitting record, shouting, Stacy, I love you, but you can't come in here and attack me with a knife. It was at that moment when I realised he was a monster. That obviously wasn't what happened. I didn't go there and attack him with a knife, although sometimes I do think I probably should have. But I expect that was him preparing his alibi, because even he knew, I believed deep down, that he'd gone too far. Luckily, I'd always kept a spare car key in my bra for when things felt particularly volatile, and I escaped to my nearest friend's home. And when he opened the door, he was absolutely horrified by what he saw. The next morning, I remember him gently knocking on the spare room door and saying, "Stace, you can stay here for as long as you need, but I just don't have girl shit." So off we went round the supermarket that day, and as you can imagine, the looks I got severely bruised around my neck and my face. But then people were looking at my dear friend, thinking he was the perpetrator just because he was male. And it was that horrible experience that gave me the idea for Escabags here in Australia. I wanted to bridge the gap between the time of escape and reaching your point of safety. Escape bags for families and individuals, no matter what time of day it is. To avoid that trip and that feeling of complete and utter vulnerability and shame, but most of all to prevent people at that most lethal time when the perpetrator has lost all control and we see so much avoidable loss of life. So I had this idea, Mozzie and I again. We popped up to Officeworks and I got my little whiteboard and we'd sit there, SOS bags, DV bags, escape bags, Escabags. That's it, love. That's it. Right then, I expect that's it then. So I had this idea and just didn't have the confidence. Just a little project, still sewing those bags. But then on the 19th of February 2020, I, like many of us here today, will remember waking up to the horrific news of Hannah Clark and her 3 beautiful children being doused in petrol on the way to school by their own father and her estranged husband. Hannah and I were the same age and we were very similar, especially the types of abuse that we'd endured. And it was at that moment that I realised I simply couldn't look the other way anymore. That evening at Mozzie's, I stayed up all night and completed a very basic website. I promised myself that I would never feel like that again, that I possibly could have helped someone, but didn't through lack of confidence and fear of failure. The next day, on the 20th of February 2020, Escabags was born. Fast forward what will be 5 years in February, and Escabags has distributed over 12,500 single adult and parent and child escape bags throughout Australia. We've also got just over 1,700 Escabags stockists, which are registered not-for-profit organisations or privately owned businesses throughout the country. However, it is our goal to ensure that we've got at least one stockist in every suburb in Australia. And that goal was set by me long before I realised just how many bloody suburbs are in Australia. Thanks for the vodka. She knows me too well. How I didn't come from your uterus, I don't know. Anyway. Unfortunately, in February of last year, I was informed by the Department of Immigration that my protection visa had been declined. Vince, you got the contacts, mate. Make it happen. But the reason for that rejection is because the Department of Immigration believes that the policing in the UK is adequate enough to keep me safe because I can live in Wales, Scotland or Ireland. I don't have to live in England. They told me that in writing, and I had 28 days to leave the country and I wasn't even allowed to come back as a visitor. And that was about 4 months after New South Wales Women of the Year award. Biggest kick in the guts. Or I could appeal the decision. Of course, I'm appealing the decision with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which I've been told by my new lawyer to expect 99.9% that she's sure that it will be rejected again for the same reasons, but to use this as a stepping stone for ministerial intervention. This has been a horrific thing to go through. Reliving all the abuse and the trauma. Is my time up? Was that Leanne? I've got to move the car. Someone move Leanne's car, please, so I can carry on with my bloody appeal. Anyway, thanks, Leanne. No one should have to go through this process, and I believe with the current system, the burden still lies with the victim and not the perpetrator. But I've always said I've not come this far just to come this far. And hopefully, if I do get that big green tick of approval, I'll work on an even bigger goal of mine. And that is law reform of protection visas, so that people escaping domestic abuse from overseas are given the chance to live a life free from fear in this country, like I hope to one day. My battle is far from over, but I will not give up. In my darkest moments in the women's shelter, I truly believed in some kind of greater power, that my current circumstances were leading to something truly amazing. And let's face it, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect the dots looking back. The perpetrator of my abuse perfected the art of manipulating people, programming them into exactly what he needed them to be. Vulnerable people around him became sponges, moulded in exactly what he needed you to be. But today, I give him back all the negativity that he put into me, and I take back the woman that I once was and become even better. And what this has taught me is that it is possible you can go from being a victim of your circumstances to being in control and being powerful as a result of those circumstances. That being hurt does not give you permission to hurt others. You always, always have a choice to be kind. Sometimes to complete strangers, even ones you find on a boat. But there is hope, and not only will you love again and be loved, you will also learn to love yourself again. And I hope by me sharing my story with you all this afternoon, it proves to anybody in this room that needs to hear it, that caged birds can indeed fly again. Thank you for listening.
Absolutely. I think we need a special round of applause for Mozzie as well.
Teaspoon or a fridge magnet. That's not me, I brought it.
Thank you so much, Stacey Jane. Please, another round of applause for that amazing story of hope and resilience, ultimately.